Hello to everyone who's watching and welcome to Newcastle Institute's webinar series and the very first webinar for 2021. Tonight our topic is Rethinking Community and Politics, Doing Politics Differently. But firstly, just let me say one or two things. Firstly, I'd like to say that Newcastle has been a place of learning for thousands of years. And I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land where I sit, the Awabakal and the Warramai people, and pay respects to elders past, present, but also to acknowledge all of those who continue to make Newcastle a place of learning, a place of discovery, and a place of living. Welcome to all our members and viewers across Australia and beyond. Just a couple of housekeeping issues. If you have a question, you can ask it on the Q&A button on Zoom. At the bottom of your Zoom screen, or in the comments on the Facebook page, which is being monitored live stream as we speak now. We'll take questions from the audience after we've had some discussion by the panel. Firstly, let me introduce the panel. Firstly, I'd like to introduce Associate Professor Sarah Motta. Sarah convenes the politics discipline at the University of Newcastle. And she's worked for over 2 decades with communities in Europe, Latin America, and Australia. She has co-authored numerous radical education projects and processes, has published very widely with over 60 articles, numerous books. Her latest book, Liminal Subjects, Weaving Our Liberation, won the 2019 Best Gender Theory and Feminist Book, win the International Studies Associate. She's currently writing her next book, Motherwise. Welcome, Sarah. Cathy McGowan. In 2013, Cathy McGowan broke the Liberal Nationals Coalition's hold on the seat of Indi, becoming the very first independent member for the North East Victorian electorate and the first female independent to sit on the parliamentary crossbench. Her successful grassroots campaigns sparked nationwide interest in the potential of community-based independent politicians to chart a new course for Australian democracy, demonstrating that when politics relates to a community, the power of a community is unleashed. In 2020, Cathy published Cathy Goes to Canberra, and it's a great read, and it's available at all good bookshops. It's Monash Publishing, you can get it through there. And for those of you who are in Newcastle, Maclean's Bookshop in Beaumont Street has this wonderful book. It's a great read. Our third panelist is Andrew Lee. Andrew is an Australian politician, a lawyer, an author, and a former professor of economics at the Australian National University. He's been a Labor member of the Australian House of Representatives since 2010, representing the seat of Fraser until 2016, and then since then, the seat of Fenner. In 2020, Andrew published Reconnected, a community builder's handbook with Nick Tyrrell, also available at good bookshops and also available at Maclean's Bookshop here in Newcastle. Andrew is currently the Shadow Assistant Minister for Treasury and the Shadow Assistant Minister for Charities. So welcome to you all, and thank you very much for joining us. Andrew, if I look at some of the data, I see that satisfaction with democracy is at its lowest level since the constitutional crisis in the 1970s. 56% of Australians believe that the government is run for a few big interests, while just 12% believe that the government is run for all the people. In your book, Reconnected, you outline in chapter 2 a lot of the issues about disengagement, disenchantment, and even just deep unhappiness with the political process. Could you set the scene for us and frame the problems of as you see it?
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Robert. It's a real honour to be here today, speaking to you from Ngunnawal lands, and I too would pay respect to the elders, past and present, of the Ngunnawal people, and acknowledge any Indigenous people who are part of tonight's conversation. It is pretty dire, whether or not you look at the pointy end of politics or at the most basic participation end. The share of Australians who are members of political parties has fallen markedly since the 1950s, when all the major parties could boast around 1% of the adult population as members. Now it's more like 1/3%. We've also seen a decline in the share of people who say that they're part of political groups in the recent Australian Social Survey, as well as a decline in the share of people who cast a valid vote. In other words, who turn up to the polling booth and don't scrawl obscenities over the ballot paper. You'd think that as Australians have become more educated and more literate, that the share of us casting valid votes would be going up, but in fact, it's been going down. And as you said before, too many Australians believe that government is run for the benefit of a small number of vested interests. And those surveys are taken before sports rorts, they're taken before the events that have seen 3 ministers now stepping out of cabinet for various reasons, one of whom is opposing an independent investigation into sexual assault. None of that can be good for the standing of Australian politicians and for government as a whole. Particularly for those of us who believe that government has a role in improving the world, this is a real challenge. But there's great organisations around at the same time, Robert. There's a lot of participatory budgeting initiatives going on. I've done some work with the University of Canberra on putting on deliberative democracy forums. There's technology that now allows you to do a tele-town hall, and our recent one got 8% of the electorate engaged. So I don't want anyone to go away thinking that there aren't answers out there. I think there's some splendid community entrepreneurs looking at how to make politics work, unions thinking about new ways of organising, community groups interfacing across traditional boundaries, and civic entrepreneurs who hold the secret to turning around these trends.
The whole idea about community engagement is something that you, Kathy, really unleashed in the seat of Indi. Can you tell us about that and your experience and why you ran as an independent and what happened?
Yes, and good evening, everybody. So there's two things about democracy that I want to place on the table. One is that one really important ingredient is competition, and the other ingredient is participation. And effective democracies have lots of competition and they need lots of participation. And in my electorate, which is Northeast Victoria, the towns of Wangaratta, Wodonga, Mansfield, the snowfields of Northeast Victoria, we didn't have any competition and we had very little participation. And there's a whole lot of reasons why we didn't have that to do with a whole lot of things that were going on. We were a safe seat and people, I think, had very much disillusioned. So the opportunity was twofold, was actually to keep being a safe seat or to do something about it. And it was the young people in the electorate who, I think, particularly with climate change, but also we had very poor mobile phone coverage, our train line wasn't working, education wasn't being funded. So the impact of poor government was real. Said, we really want to do something about it.
I read in your book, Kathy, that the train...
The consequence of that...
I was just going to say, I read in your book that the train from Melbourne now to Wodonga is slower than it was in Ned Kelly's day.
It still is, it still is. So dysfunctional government had a really important part to play in it. So what we decided to do was to use those elements of democracy to create some competition through participation. And we were a community group, so participation for us meant getting the community involved. Now, other people can try it with different ways, but for us, a rural community where we've still got strong communities. And when we went out and did these kitchen table conversations, which I'm happy to talk to in more detail, we asked 3 questions. The first question was, what do you love about your community? The second question was, what do you want from your representatives? And then the third question was about, well, what are the issues that need to be addressed in order for your wishes for your community to be fulfilled? And in that process, we unleashed this amazing, surprising interest in the participation. And so in our group, we were able to use people's want to be involved in politics to create the competition. And I think we are incredibly lucky in a way that the competition was enough to, we hope to make the seat marginal, but the result was me getting elected by 439 votes. So, but since then, what we've, as you say, unleashed is this huge interest from other community groups. They don't have any competition, they're in safe seats, they want something better, and they're saying, well, we don't have access to a whole lot of money resources, but we have people resources. Is there a hope for us with this? And I just want to make the final comment in this introductory session about hope, because I do back what Andrew says. It's the taking of the hope and making it political that we've done, I think, well. So we've been able to transform people's wishes for better democracy, wishes to participate, and use the vehicle of democracy as a way of doing it. So last weekend, we hosted an online conference for community-minded independence, and we called it Getting Elected. And we had over 300 people participate for the weekend from 78 electorates around Australia. So I really am, I think we're on a cusp of community seeing that there is a way forward, and it is about competition and participation, and community is the key to that.
So given the opportunity to participate and a sense that it will work and it has hope, people want to be engaged.
And we needed to have you need to have two other things. Three. You need a good candidate, you need a good campaign, you need community. So that's the package, but you also need skilled leadership. And the skilled leadership is what needed to bring the community together. If you don't have the skilled leadership, it's almost impossible to do. And skilled leaders help the community reach its potential, provide learning opportunity, provide networking opportunity, and provide the physical resources, help the community provide the physical resources to go forward. But you absolutely need the leadership and skilled community leadership to do it.
Sarah, what's happening around the rest of the world? Is disengagement, disenchantment with politics and the process, a feeling of being left out and marginalised, is that common across other countries, other nations, or is it unique to Australia?
Yeah, before I begin, I'd like to honour the traditional custodians of the land where I'm sitting, which is in the meeting of salt and fresh water of the Wabakal and Worimi peoples and their unceded territories, and honouring the sovereignty. And also convocar las energías de mis abuelas para que estén con nosotros hoy día y que tengan un diálogo con mi escucha profunda. Yep, there's definitely these trends of disconnection and of disillusionment and of hurt from many communities around the globe. They're not new, but they're obviously in the last 20 years have been accentuating. And we see that in the rise of movements such as Black Lives Matter, with its epicenter in the United States, with movements such as Ni Una Menos, which is a massively big, not one more feminist movement with its epicenter in Buenos Aires in Argentina, and with forms of Occupy, with some of its epicenter in Europe. And all of these movements and communities are really attempting to reoccupy and redefine the political and the public, and are really stretching the understanding that politics is a big P, kind of done by people far away and displaced from your own everyday concerns and your own embedded realities and struggles and wisdoms, and kind of is contesting in many ways the idea that politics is reducible to the casting of a vote. And I would say a kind of trying to reimagine the very institutions and the very logics and the very languages and the very knowledges with which you constitute authority and power, how you reproduce your community, how you ensure health and education and housing, and what kind of economies we want to nurture into the coming century.
What communities around the world have found a solution?
So if we understand politics as always open-ended and as processual, and is about, I mean, there are many different values that can underlie what we understand democracy to be, or decolonizing to be, or liberation to be. But say if we talk about questions of well-being, or if we talk about questions of healing justice, then sometimes this involves being able to farm your own land, and connecting back to traditions and wisdoms that have been historically and now displaced by agribusiness and monoculture, and that you're able to nurture forms of education which are very much embedded with a recognition of the wisdoms of communities, and when you're able to ensure that politics, as in transforming unequal and hierarchical and extractive political relationships, occur from the bedroom to the street, in the community, and then across communities. So there are many, many different institutional forms, and there are many different ways in which we might value what success might be. But I think fundamental to that is actually flipping the script on kind of models that look outside and evaluate abstractly about, against criteria that are those of particular communities, and rather to ask communities about what they would consider are the criteria of success and meaning, and that would inevitably be multiple, and that multiple interculturalness is absolutely fundamental. You know, if we want to re-enchant the political, and we want to honour people's own intellectual and political capacities to create their own worlds and life worlds.
Many of the indicators that we're fed by the media and generally are around economic indicators. Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, recently said that economic growth accompanied by worsening social outcomes is not success, it is a failure. Why aren't we measuring those issues that you talked about, Sarah, like the justice and equity and well-being? Do we value those things as much, and why don't we report on them?
Do you want me to carry on? Because I feel
yes, sure.
You know, I think communities and individuals are megally complex, but what gets represented on kind of the renditions of what is political narrative and media tends to make that pretty unidimensional and reduce that complexity. So I think we've witnessed over the last 20 to 30 years very much the closing of political horizons and hollowing out of the public, and kind of the increasing power of kind of unelected and transnational groups. And with that, a kind of disarticulation of sorry, I've got a cough. A disarticulation of many of the popular and working class and other community political identities, right? So there's been a kind of a dissolving of the past confines and narratives, right, that gave meaning, created political identity, and that has created this hollowed out political debate. So, you know, sometimes when we're teaching politics in the uni, often students think originally that what we're doing is something that has nothing to do with them. Yeah, the politics has got nothing to do with their lives, and it's kind of this boring grey thing over there behind closed doors. Yeah, so what we try to do is re-enchant the politics by saying actually politics happens everywhere, in communities, in you know, in our bedrooms, in our around questions of economy, and that actually we can be co-creators in reimagining that. So I think that to begin to re-articulate different narratives and different stories, it's fundamentally important, as the other two speakers have kind of talked about from their own experiences and from their own trajectories that they follow, to begin to re-articulate connections amongst people in our community, to begin to re-articulate possibilities and other stories that can make sense of, you know, precarities in work, of mental health challenges, of increasing poverty, of the inability to be able to have secure housing that's increasing, for ecological problems, and that actually being embedded within community and being experimental and opening up spaces where we can begin to recognize that politics is something of us. Yeah, it's of us. It's not, it doesn't and shouldn't be something out there that is unreachable and seems completely disconnected to those realities of everyday life. So I think whilst there's disillusion and there's disjuncture, there's also all this incredible possibility, which I know we're going to talk about later with some of the things that are emerging. But there's stuff happening in Newcastle, which is amazing too, which I'll talk about later.
Andrew, as an economist, why don't we talk more about affordable housing, about well-being, about justice, about equity?
Robert, I think the problem may be that people haven't studied enough economics, because all you have to do is walk into day one of an economics class and you'll be told that economics isn't about maximising money, it's about maximising happiness.
Yes.
We call it sometimes utility or well-being, but no economist worth their salt would say that maximising GDP ought to be the goal of a worthy society. We need to make sure that we're measuring a whole wide range of things. We're doing a better job now of measuring income distribution, looking at where that money goes and identifying some of the divergences, like the fact that over the last 12 months, Australia's billionaires have increased their wealth some 50% at the same time as wages at the middle and the bottom haven't budged. For Reconnected, we also put into the field some new surveys asking people how many close friends they had and how many neighbours they knew. And Nick Terrell and I were shocked to discover that the typical Australian has half as many close friends as in 1984 and knows half as many as their neighbours as they did back then. So we have to do a better job of measuring these things and therefore telling a big story. I thought one of the great things about what Sarah was saying was that emphasis on stories, because they are always more powerful than statistics. And for me, one of the big stories of the past generation has been the move of Australia from a society of we and us towards an individualistic society of me and I. And that's true of inequality, of social disconnection. And indeed, Nick and I show that if you use Google Books to look at the words commonly used in Australian books published from decade to decade, that Australian books now are more likely to contain the individualistic pronouns I and me, and less likely to contain the collectivist pronouns we and us.
Kathy, what's changed in rural and regional areas?
So there's still community in the regions. Now I can't speak for the city. And we were able to build even more community by using politics. And when we won, the community got a huge sense of, oh my God, this actually works. And that reinforcement of political activity getting a worthwhile outcome got me re-elected the second time and got Helena Haynes elected the third time. So I think we've failed to actually close the loop and make the connection really clearly between how you vote and the outcome. That's one thing to say. But the other thing I just want to propose, having listened to Andrew about economics, I think there's something else happening in the system. And I've watched very closely how government has reacted to COVID. And initially, the government did the economics of job seeker, job keeper, and then they did the health stuff of managing the health. And I kept on waiting for government in some form or variety to say, and the third leg of this stool is community. If we could get community as well as economic and health, we could actually, through the COVID, build community and support people where they live. But there's almost been a total failure of government departments, government ministers to actually see community as a really effective way of addressing issues such as COVID and a lot of other issues. And I think that exists because the people who are in government and the people who are in the bureaucracy have never actually got community. And I also think that that could come down to gender, but I don't actually think it is only gender. I think that the current modern society is, as Andrew was saying, independent and it's a me. And the interdependence that community brings has lost a lot of its, resourcefulness, I suppose. But I've watched in the communities that have managed COVID really well, community leadership has bubbled to the fore. Communities have got together in small organising groups and sent letters up and down the street or had, play dates or whatever they've done, certainly in Victoria is where I'm speaking from. And when you haven't had that community leadership, people have been stuck and isolated in their homes. Now, I'm not saying it's the only answer, but I do say it's just caused me some degree of interest, is to say to people like Andrew and policymakers in the system, well, knowing those statistics that you're talking about, how are we going to, I think, re-engage community? And again, I say to the Labor Party, they did it so well under Whitlam. When Whitlam was in power, they had these regional projects, they had money going to communities, they had such a commitment to the community and building education in the community, and we seem to have lost it. Now, I don't think the Nats and the Libs have ever had it, but certainly David did have it there for a very strong, for a good chunk of time, and did really good policy around it. But I don't see that connection in Labor policy currently. But Andrew can tell me I'm just missing it and it is there. That'd be great.
Could I add something?
Sure.
About community? Just that I actually, my experience has been that representations that community is more individualized can be really problematic, because Australian lands have multiple communities, and our First Nation kin obviously enacting every day other forms of sovereignty and survivance and strength is based on logics of connection and care and recognition and reciprocity, and that's ongoing and is really a backbone, I think, of many possibilities in our contemporary lands. But also, if I think about during the fires, when kind of the government disappeared and it was left to people to support each other, and the kinds of mutual aid that developed to support families and communities and to house each other. And during COVID, like I know around the country and with different levels of intensity, there were all these kind of mutual aid and community networks set up. So I think, sometimes the dominant stories which represent ordinary Australians as depoliticized and individualistic can be actually not as useful, because they can hide that there are other forms of political organisation going on, and other webs and connections of collectivity, and other webs and connections of power and authority that continue and that are building despite the kind of abandonment of the state and a lot of the political classes. So yeah, I think we need to make more complexified our stories and actually look at what's going on in community, not as a means necessarily to channel it into traditional institutional forms, but as a means to maybe learn how we might reinvent institutions of democracy and authority and economy, actually, in terms of multiple economies.
We touched briefly on before some of the concerns around accountability, and I think, Andrew, you mentioned a couple of things like the sports rorts, and I'm thinking about the failure to develop a national ICAC, which the community has been saying loudly and clearly, we really need to do this, and yet there's a continual pushback. There's been the Royal Commission in Aged Care, and yet we've known about the issues involved in aged care for such a long time, and now the Victorian one on mental health. What can we do as citizens to ensure that governments actually respond to what the community wants? And Kathy, maybe you could tell us about that kitchen, what did you call it? A kitchen policy or something?
We call them kitchen table conversations. Kitchen
table conversations.
Yeah. So that was a process where people could come together and be listened to at a deep level. It's not a process for getting government to act.
Right.
It could be part of the step. But for me, I'm really interested in Andrew having a bit of a go at that question, because I don't know the answer to it. And last century, in the 1900s, for example, you could have joined a political party, you could have joined the farmer organisation, you could have become a representative of the National Farmer Organisation and ridden through the ranks or local government and been part of a policy process, and the parties followed the policy process. But I think there's such a disconnect now between organisations and political change. And I don't think the media have no longer got the critical mass that they had where they could play that role. And social media, I think it's noisy, but it doesn't have the political power. So it's a bit like what Sarah was saying. We need to reinvent not so much the institutions, but to actually acknowledge the chaos in the system and go, well, what's the way through this? But the bit that I'm really interested to watch is just while we were getting ready to talk tonight, I was talking to Sarah and others, because on Monday, the 15th, there's this March for Justices taking place around Australia. Now, I live in a little community in Northeast Victoria, and we're gathering in Albury. And so many of the people I know are going to go to a place to have a march. And that's going to be great. There'll be hundreds and hundreds and maybe thousands of people marching. But I haven't yet seen the connection between the outrage and the absolute anger with what's currently happening in Canberra with a strategy to get it fixed. And I haven't heard anything from the Labor Party saying, okay, here's what we're going to do about this. And the ICAC, we've seen with the ICAC, like the minister responsible for the ICAC is the one caught in the middle of the trouble. So what are the chances of the ICAC actually ever coming off the ground, like a zilch? So the question I want to know is, when you've got this outrage that you're experiencing, you go and have a demonstration, whose role in our society is it? It's more than community. Community can say we're outraged, but who's going to put the pieces together and actually be the answer to the problem we've got? It's not going to be the Liberal National Party. Is it the opposition? Is it the Senate? Is it media? I don't know the answer, and I'd be fascinated.
Andrew.
I think the answer to the outrage around sexual assaults is that there ought to be a proper process for dealing with complaints within the Parliament. I hope that Kate Jenkins' review ends up recommending something along the lines that the British Parliament has now, which is a non-partisan complaints process. And for Christian Porter, there needs to be an independent inquiry conducted by somebody like Vivienne Thom, who's did a recent inquiry into scandals surrounding the head of ASIC. Until there's an independent inquiry, the issue isn't going to go away. And if Christian Porter is innocent, as he says, this ought to be in his interest as well. So I suspect that the march on Monday, which is going to be a big event at Parliament, perfectly timed to put pressure on the government and a great expression of people power, will coalesce around a call for an independent inquiry, which is what the opposition's been calling for the last week.
But Andrew,
on some of the...
Andrew,
just jumping
stop a sec. What happens when the government says, no, we're not going to do it? What happens when all that outrage is there and then absolutely the status quo remains for the next year or longer? I hear what you're saying, but where do we get the action in the system to the political change that we need?
Well, then we need to change the government. This is the issue of something like climate change. You can put all the pressure you like on the government, but the fact is that they're in thrall to a group of climate troglodytes, and we're not going to get any action without changing the government. But I want to reflect on some of the really thoughtful comments that have been made by my two co-panellists around political engagement too. One of the best books that I've read over the last year on this topic is by the political scientist Etan Hirsch from Tufts University. And it's called Politics is for Power. And what Etan argues is that too much of what passes for political engagement is in fact what he calls hobbyism. It's people thinking that engagement on social media is true engagement with politics. Sometimes it can make a contribution, but more often it's akin to going along to a sporting game and cheering for your team and jeering at the other side. It's sitting on the sidelines rather than being on the field. To be on the field is to go along to a local council meeting to complain about a new development and to suggest better ways of working in the community. It's to find somebody in your community who thinks differently from you and try and persuade them, rather than just engaging in echo chamber conversations with people who think just like you. It's doing the work rather than imagining that politics is something that other people do. And I was really struck by Sarah's comment on this, that that's what she's getting her politics students to do as well. It's so important that people see politics as being a mass participation activity rather than an elite one. And it can happen in all sorts of organisations. On the call tonight is one of the participants is Andrew Dodd, who's a Baptist minister in Newcastle, somebody who has been done terrific work with his church, reaching out to gay and lesbian and marginalised communities in Newcastle, providing them with a safe and welcoming space. And in some sense, pushing back against the stereotype that people might otherwise have of Baptists. That sort of work in the community is really vital.
And Andrew, I might just say about Andrew Dodd, in your book, you talk about social entrepreneurs. I think he's a classic case. So he spends his life making life better, coming up with creative ways to make life better for people. Not only what he's done for the gay and lesbian, the LGBTI community, but also for things like Parkrun and other things too. He's a genuine social entrepreneur. So, you know, I think he's a treasure that we should value very much.
Jodie's amazing. We should clone him.
Can I add something too? There's lots of things I would like to add, but I'm aware of time and space. But I actually think we need to also reimagine leadership.
Yeah.
I think we need to move away from pyramid structures of leaders with great leaders who kind of speak about and for and impress and have a charisma, and towards facilitating the conditions of possibility where we can all embrace our capacity to be change agents, right, and to be collective members of our communities. And that actually goes to the heart of the question of this March for Justice, because if we look historically at the relationship between colonisation and forms of masculinity in Australia and how that plays itself out. So how a lot of white masculinity in Australia was really formed at the point of invasion and on the campsites of the settlements where Indigenous women and children were often brutalised. And that was the formation, right? The historic formation and the psychic formation that has played itself out into the contemporary period and continues to in dynamics of extractivism, in dynamics of abuse that crisscross the state and institutions and that continue to impact disproportionately on First Nations communities within high rates of incarcerations, death in custody, massive rates of child removal. And it kind of strikes me that there needs to be a kind of inside out re-articulation of our relationships together in forms that are based on care and connection and reciprocity, and listening to those voices who've been consistently at the rough end of that, and from their wisdoms reimagining the nature of leadership, actually reimagining the nature of institutions and sovereignty, and that it goes actually a lot deeper than how do we re-articulate community angst and disillusionment back into institutions that are so bound up with those historical legacies and those psychic legacies of how we think politics, what it looks like, you know, that it's not about the deep listening and the care and the connection. It is so much about kind of power over an extraction and who can kind of win the debate. So I think this goes really deep to the heart of the psyche. And so therefore it takes it to the intimacies in our everyday life and our forms of subjecthood and identity quite deeply. And I do think there's incredible work already going on with this actually in our communities that's often not seen.
We've got a couple of questions that people have posted up from the audience, and I want to sort of combine a couple of them together and also refer, Kathy, to something that you mentioned when in your book. I think historically Australia has been a deeply divided country. It's been deeply divided over race, over religion, over politics, and often when someone is elected to Parliament, they seem to somehow forget that they represent everyone in their electorate. You talk about the divisions when you were at school, catching the bus and those sorts of things. And then Brad Webb talks about, in one of the questions that he's asked on live, he says a lot of the movement from we to I that Andrew mentioned about is no more apparent than in social media. And the use by the major political parties of just polling-driven issues. You know, they just data poll all the time and in order to see if they're going to be re-elected. And Steve Munro asked the question online about if an issue is not aligned with one of the factions, even though that it gets ignored. So where do we go with all of this? What do we do to ensure voices can? What are some strategies that we can use to ensure our voices are better heard? All voices across the community, not just the powerful, not just the powerful or all voices. Andrew, do you want to give it a go?
Yeah, absolutely. Two things we've really enjoyed doing over the last year have been a deliberative democracy forum and a teletown hall. I mentioned them before, but let me go into a little bit more detail. A deliberative democracy forum is where you bring citizens together to focus on a specific issue or a challenge. In this case, we picked the upcoming conscience vote on mitochondrial donation and drew together a group of people for both an online and an in-person forum. We allocated a lot of time, an hour, to talk through just a single issue, but I found my thinking greatly deepened by the engagement with both the ethical and the scientific issues of the people that came together on that. And then the Teletown Hall, which reflects the fact that it's just pretty tough for someone with a job that requires long hours, or who has kids to look after in the evening and a full-time job, to get along to a lot of traditional town halls. We have them, of course, along with the street corner meetings, but the Teletown Hall got a greater degree of take-up in the community than anything else we've done. We phoned everyone in the electorate, and if they wanted to ask a question, they could easily just press one on their phones, and they were then put through and able to participate in the conversation. So it was broadening that democratic conversation, allowing more people to get in, and giving that sense that politics is not just something that other people do. I'm sure there's a host of other ideas that people do. Pretty much we're in the business of throwing everything on the wall and seeing what sticks. I've got 2 podcasts. I send out a monthly email update. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, constantly out there in the community, visiting community organisations and talking to people. But with a big electorate, you're going to miss some people, and you always want to make sure that you're improving the ways in which you engage, so you're not using 19th century techniques to try and engage with the 21st century audience.
Kathy?
Oh, sorry.
So I wanted to, yes. And I'm also incredibly, so I'm actually talking about the current government, and how do you actually, given they're the government we've got, and who knows when we might get another Labor government that could do what Andrew talks about, how do we actually get this government to be more responsive? And the only thing that I have actually seen that is working is court cases, using the institutions of the legal system. So Rabo debt, nothing happened until there was a court case. Refugees, nothing happened, and now slowly they're being, particularly the ones in indefinite detention in Australia that have come from Nauru and Manus, court cases have seen some of them being released. So, and while I'm not saying community voices are important, but sometimes the issues are so big and so entrenched that you actually need the power of the equal institution to actually create the change in it. So I'm becoming a big one for court cases and using the civil and legal system and calling out bad practice and getting the lawyers that we need. And I know there are a huge number of young, enthusiastic, diverse voices coming through the legal system, and somehow them having the power. And I know there's just a case in Victoria at the moment where a group of school kids, with assistance of one of their teachers who happened to be a nun, have taken the Minister for Environment to court around her the responsibility of future generations around climate change. And I'm just so pleased to see the courts being used for that sort of purpose, because I can't think of what else is going to cause the government to actually respond. They seem so entrenched and so caught within their own narrow paradigms, I suppose.
I'm going to tell you a story about this week. So this week we've been organising the March for Justice here in Newcastle. And we've kind of tried to create this as a space that's intersectional and that honours First Nations women and their kin for being on the front line of both violences, but also in survivance and wisdom. And we've created a space of listening and of generosity. Somebody said in the meeting, we had a visioning meeting the other day, of generosity. So a generosity which implies a listening to the other, and a generosity that implies unlearning this idea So there's one right way of organising this march. There's one right way that we can understand what unity is. There's one right slogan that's the one right slogan. There's one right way we can understand what logistics means. There's one right interpretation of gendered violence. And so we're creating that space, and what that means is we're flipping the script. So that means we're centering survivors as the wisdom holders, and survivors who are often at the forefront of organising organisations and peer organisations like Survivors Are Up here in Newcastle, or it's actually in Toronto. And in doing that, we're also reimagining public space. So the way that we're going to do our gathering is a festival, and a festival that in the civic park is opposite where I'm sitting now, New Space, which is one of the sites of the University of Newcastle. And we want to open that up to different groups. You know, there'll be kids circle, elder circle, drum circle, art, music, the different expressions and voice. So the idea that political voice can take many, many different forms. But also when we're doing the speeches, we're not going to have just speeches where people are speaking and the audience remains passive. We're going to have a couple of platform speakers who are leading kind of survivor organizations, but we're also going to have an open mic. And we're not going to like try to say, you have to speak in a particular way. You have to be, you know, a formal way of articulating your story, yeah, and your truth and your wisdoms. And in that experience this week, I've learned so much. I've been involved with politics since I was like 7 and I was leafleting with my mom. I'm now 47, right? And this has been one of the most amazing experiences this week, to actually work through difference between different women identifying allies, and to try and find a space where we can truly make it intersectional, and we can truly flip the script to support the articulation of multiple voices. These are multiple voices, and there are multiple ways that we can begin to say enough and make demands, particular demands for policy changes, particular demands for inquiries, but also somebody else said in the meeting on Monday, that actually there's a crisis in housing, in DV services, women are being turned away, often going to the police is more traumatic, going through the court system is, you know, horrendous and re-traumatizing. Actually, who do we have? We have each other. And there are these incredible networks of care, of support, of food. You know, Food Not Bombs is beautiful in Newcastle, of you know, peer-led survivor projects that are providing housing and food and support and information. And I think if there's any possibility of reimagining, re-articulating a democratic politics that is just and is decolonizing and inclusive, then it actually does need to be there. That doesn't mean to say that sometimes juridically the kinds of things that Kathy talked about are not a from, but I actually think this thing of re-articulating our voices in the plural is really, really important, and expanding what we think is a political subject, and who knows, and the languages that we speak in politics.
I think the march in Canberra is going to be big, and there's one in Newcastle, and there's one in Wodonga, as you mentioned, Kathy, and in other places around. But many people, I think, in regional areas and very small and remote communities feel that their voice is never heard over the noise that is made from the larger capital cities and the larger regional centres. Kathy, you've lived in a regional community all your life in the beautiful Indigo Valley. What issues confront those rural, regional, and remote communities that are completely different, that are quite different to what those that confront those who live in large urban centres?
Oh, infinite. So public transport, basic infrastructure, mobile phones that work, internet that works, TV. In some of the parts of my electorate of Northeast Victoria, the TV comes by satellite, and it's mostly in Parja from Central Australia. For example, access to education. Like the states do a reasonably good job on primary school and secondary, but the poverty of our tertiary education. So for example, when I last paid attention, 13% of the people in Northeast Victoria had a tertiary degree. In Melbourne, the number's something like 56, and the national figure is something like 22%. and we're down there at 13%. We can't get education. And during COVID, what went was money to universities. Like, it's a shocker. And they're not even talking about things that Sarah just mentioned, like homelessness and jobs and access to health and access to mental health. Yeah. But the thing is, we are rich in many instances, we're rich in community. We're really rich in the we. We're rich in the interdependence. And in many of the communities that I know, communities still function. They're places where there's a village that will look after a young person, that a lot of care and informal mentoring still happens. So while we don't have some stuff, we do have other stuff. But I just have to do a call out to the absolute failure of the National Party to represent modern rural and regional Australia. And even when there are Liberal Party people representing the seats as across the border in Albury and Farrer, the lack of regional policy, the lack of a vision for regional Australia, the lack of understanding about climate change and how it impacts on us, the lack of understanding about mental health issues and works, it's just diabolical. So you almost don't go there because it's just so pathetic. So you work with what you've got to make it a little bit better rather than what you would wish for and hope it was there.
Is that a new development, Kathy? I mean, you worked for a Liberal federal member for a number of years. What was it like?
No, I don't think Australia's ever had a policy for regional Australia, ever, because the two major parties are urban based. And the National Party would have looked after maybe farmers, but never regional centres, never the Waggers, never the Albury Wodongas. I can't speak for Newcastle, but there's never been a sense of what's the place for regional Australia in the national psyche. It just doesn't exist. So there's no vision for it and there's no funding for it.
Or places like Deniliquin or Finley.
Or even the smaller country towns.
That's
so
right.
There's just no vision, there's no process, and there's no will in and there's no will because the National Party, for example, sell their balance of power so cheaply that we get such little benefit from it. So one of the things that I'm really working forward is for people to understand that competitive nature of politics, that if you don't compete, if you don't have a competitive seat, then you're outside the game and things are never going to change for you. You've actually got to be in that small number of seats that are marginal and that there's a chance of things swinging, which is then the role for the independents to actually help that happen.
If we look overseas, the US experience suggests that high levels of disenchantment lead to what we might call the Trump phenomena. Are we in danger of that, Andrew?
Not immediately, but certainly the rise of populism hasn't left Australia unscathed. The major party vote has been falling and it falls as you move further away from capital cities. So there is a greater sense of disenchantment further in regional Australia, even more so in remote Australia. Part of that is economics, is making sure that people have good jobs that are able to sustain a family and pay a mortgage. And we've seen over recent years the erosion of those good, stable jobs. Wage stagnation has played a part in making people frustrated with politics. You see this in the US, but you also see it in parts of Australia, like northern Tasmania, that have been more left behind than others. To some extent, though, it's also that meld of federal, state and local leadership. And I'm really struck by the distinction between Newcastle and Wollongong. Both of them were heavily reliant on heavy industry a generation ago. And as that heavy industry has moved away, Newcastle has fared much better than Wollongong. And I've explored this with my colleagues who represent each of the seats and the extent to which federal money and local leadership played a part. But there's something in the way in which Newcastle's done it in creating recreating a town which has a greater sense of vibrancy, greater sense of social inclusion. Look at the same-sex marriage vote in the two places, very, very different, and a greater and lower levels of unemployment in Newcastle as well. So I reckon Newcastle's got quite a bit to teach the rest of the country about dealing with technological change and forestalling the rise of populism.
Well, it's a lovely place to live. And interestingly enough, I think it's the only federal seat since Federation that has always been held by the Labor Party. It has managed to reinvent itself.
Lucky you.
Well,
yeah, there's lots of contestations too. So there's lots of contestations about the nature of the redevelopment that have been going on from the movements against supercars and questions about redevelopment of the foreshore and the whole boom in housing, which is luxury housing, which like the local community can't afford. So there's many, many layers to this, and increasing gendered homelessness and precarity is a real problem. So with the March for Justice, hearing from those who are working on the front line with this, just what a massive crisis is here and how it's really related as well with domestic violence, homelessness, how gendered. So I think there's many, many layers to this. Again, doesn't get seen often. And I also think in terms of, popular Trump and those kinds of racialized forms of politics, like both Australia and the United States have a deeply racialized democracy which systematically reproduces violences against its First Nations, in the case of Afro-Americans, right? So that's a present, and the articulation of then new forms of these kinds of racialized logics. Perhaps again, I actually have a student who's working here in Swansea around this, again through forms of popular education, through forms of coming together and actually sharing our stories and trying to find the connections where Indigenous forms of knowledges and environmental knowledges and forms of sovereignty can actually bring meaning, perhaps to white working class communities who are feeling dislocated. So I think, again, the creativity and centering the ongoing racialized dynamics of democracy, they're not new, but how they're articulating and morphing in particular ways, and what can be learned from our First Nations kin in these lands of Newcastle and surrounds. But also the complexity of the stories of development and the success of those stories and who's getting left behind with that, and this crisis that is bubbling here in this region. It's really quite severe, the housing. It's incredible, and the dislocation of community actually from the centre of Newcastle.
Like any good conversation, I'm left longing for more. But our time is almost up. And I wonder, Kathy, could you just give us maybe some final comments and observations?
So I really want to do a call out to you, Robert, and to your academic colleagues. And I know Andrew is a researcher and Sarah as well, that we rely so much on the academy to help us through this transition that we're going through. And so, Sarah, I'm just so excited to hear what your guys are going to be doing on Monday, but I hope someone writes it up and does an analysis of it and actually helps share the message with others of it, because I don't think we're going to do that in Albury-Wodonga. It'll be a standard march. So how do we actually use the best practice that's coming out of our universities to actually grow civic engagement and to grow the change? And Andrew, I'm really jealous of your community that had a town hall. I know in the last election when Helen Haynes was running, the Liberal candidate ran a virtual town hall. And the ability to actually say, well, actually not only for elections, but actually as we move through our society, how can we do it better? So my call is out for academics and the people listening tonight, the participants, to help the rest of us actually understand best practice and implement it.
Sarah?
Thanks, Kathy. That's nice to come and ask us to do stuff. Yeah, we develop quite a lot of participatory methodologies because we have this whole specialisation in participation here. And so like we've got PhD students and honours students who are doing forms of research that are with community and that participate to co-create knowledge. And I would imagine there are going to be many forms of knowledge and story told about Monday actually, and so we will share that with you, but also the kinds of methodological work too. Like really happy to be sharing the kinds of work that we're developing here, which actually is quite concentrated on that problematic. Yeah. Thank you very much for asking me to participate and to be able to dialogue with you all and kind of learn together.
It's been wonderful. Andrew?
Nick Terrell and I proposed an idea we call Sutton's Law of Social Capital, named after Willie Sutton, the bank robber, who said that he robbed banks because that was where the money was. If you want to build community, you've got to do it where the need is greatest. And that means not working solely with advantaged white communities, but working with communities of colour and disadvantaged groups. What you've heard tonight is a message from the other two speakers about the need for innovation. You know, Kathy was the original innovator when she blasted through to win the seat of Indi. I'm fascinated, Sarah, to hear what your march looks like on Monday. Again, innovate, innovate, innovate. We're up against massive challenges in Australia in civic disconnection, inequality, and a government that's doing too little to listen to Australians. But the way to get through that is to share ideas, to approach it with a smile and a sense of optimism, and to keep on trying different things and sharing with one another what we've learned. Thanks so much. It's been a real privilege to be part of the conversation tonight.
Thank you, Andrew. Next month, we have something very exciting. We have three great panellists: Jessica Allen, who's a researcher at the University of Newcastle; Chloe Hicks, who works for Matt Keane in the Minister for Environment in New South Wales, and she's leading the policy implementation for the Renewable Energy Zones initiative; and Adam Clark from the City of Newcastle Sustainability Program. They're going to be talking about new energy systems for the Hunter. In May, it's a stronger voice for Newcastle and the Committee for Hunter. And then in June, Andrew, something you might be interested in, it's the wonderful Professor Bill Mitchell on modern monetary theory. So a very big thank you to our panelists, to Kathy, to Sarah, to Andrew, and also a big thank you to you, our members and all viewers from right across the world. We have regular viewers in Queensland, in the ACT, in Melbourne, and I know that tonight we've got some people from overseas as well. If you'd like to become a member, details are on our website, newcastleinstitute.org.au. Can I also just say thank you to Robin and Ross, Matt, Brett, Roger, Alan and Mari, whose hard work behind the scenes makes all of this sort of stuff very possible. We look forward to catching up with you again next month. And again, thank you to Kathy, thank you to Sarah, and thank you very much to Andrew. That's all from us at Newcastle Institute. Good night.
Thanks, Robert. Good night.
Good night.